Chief for Environmental Contaminants for Federal Audits of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Daryl supervises the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act activities for the office, which involves providing guidance to federal aid action agencies and planning water-related projects. Daryl received her Bachelor of Science degree in Biology from the University of Cincinnati and her Master's in Science degree in Biological Sciences from the University of California, Irvine. Please welcome Daryl Lyons.
Okay. In addition to that lovely introduction, I will let you know that I have been with the Fish and Wildlife Service 27 years now, and in my first year was when I started working out at the Salton Sea, so 92, 93. So I've been around a while, even if I'm not as familiar with places as some of you. First off, I'd like to thank my panel for being here today. We've got a great lineup. We've got Nasseer Idrisi, Robert McKernan, Daniel Orr, and Tom Anderson, and they will each cover their particular topics as we go. But before that, I wanted to just give you a quick synopsis. I know you've heard some about some of this already today, but I just wanted to give you a quick reminder of where science has come at the Salton Sea. So in the early days, 1980s to early 90s, we had some seminal research that was done through the National Irrigation Water Quality Program. My colleagues, Roy Schroeder and Jim Setmeyer in particular, but others as well. We also had some important studies conducted by what is now USGS, Harry Olmendorf, Chuck Henney. These early works dealt with what was happening in the water column, what was happening with invertebrates, fish, and indeed birds in particular on part of USGS. The National Irrigation Water Quality Program continued on. We did additional studies looking at birds and bird eggs. We looked at individual drains in the Imperial Valley, and there was also some additional work conducted by USGS looking at accumulations of chemicals in suspended and bottom sediments of the Salton Sea. Then we had these, what I would call the symposia. As a result of a meeting in the desert in a very hot August of 1997, we identified, the Royal We, a large group of us, including Doug Barnum and myself, we identified a suite of studies that would be undertaken to look at the Salton Sea. And this was in a large way elicited by the bird diet that occurred in 1996. Just a whole suite of studies was done covering an incredible range of topics. And that resulted in 2 symposia taking place and also 2 special volumes of hydrobiologia to publish those studies. So that was very important research. It functions now as our baseline of where we are, relative to where we are today. A couple of other efforts farther on, the Lake and Reservoir Management Edition, the Salton Sea, included just a whole nother set of very important research. People don't know it as well as the symposia documents, but it has some great research in there as well. And then we have the report that was done based on those ponds that Doug talked about. Again, very key research that was done on a system that was small enough that people could grasp and study in depth. And I'm sure Tom has many stories to tell of his experience. And lastly, where do we go from here? Well, we've got the Salton Sea Ecosystem Monitoring and Assessment Plan. Some people refer to that as a map. It's our path forward for future monitoring work. And we also had another meeting of the minds, I'll call it, in 2017, where we talked about, okay, we've done all of this, what's next? And we put some great proposals together. Some of those are moving forward, others not, but hopefully will in the not too distant future. And with that, I will turn it over to Nasseer.
So my talk is going to be very brief. I hope, can everybody hear me in the back? Great. So I'll talk about the fish in the Salton Sea, focusing on what we were able to collect last year. And first, so here's the outline of the talk. This is how the pointer. Thank you. So water quality, basically the physical characteristics of the Salton Sea. Pupfish, monitoring tilapia, which are the other fish in the Salton Sea, and then including remoras. So first, the physical chemical characteristics. Here I have in red the TDS in grams per liter, which is equivalent to parts per thousand. And for the most part last year, it was above 60 parts per thousand. At the same time, again, with the oxygen content at the surface, it's pretty low. So this is in percent and then milligrams per liter. Very poor conditions in the Salton Sea that we would not expect to have fish in there. So first we'll talk about the desert pupfish, which again was mentioned earlier that it is a listed species. And the Salton Sink betta population, oops. The meta population consists of Salt Creek population, San Felipe Creek population, and the shoreline pools and irrigation canals surrounding the sea, which are all connected with each other. And so it is expected that as the TDS exceeds 70 grams per liter or parts per thousand, that pupfish no longer will be in the sea. One of the things that the pupfish now have to consider are competition as well as predation on the young by mosquito fish, sailfin molly, and red swamp crayfish, and other invading species. So the threat to the desert pupfish is decreasing freshwater availability, increasing salt content as TDS in the Salton Sea. So where are these locations? Salt Creek is over here to the east, middle of the Salton Sea, and then San Felipe Creek is down here. The other areas we have embayments, as well as the canals, especially to the south in Imperial County, that hosts the populations of the pupfish. If we take a look at the, also notice that the y-axis have different scales, but if we look at Barter Harbor from April until October, we see that the pupfish population is relatively stable. Here we have an increase in June, and this is likely due to an influx of the young, the pupfish young, that caused the increase. So probably taking into account the October values, that's what is recruiting into the population. And it seems to be relatively stable. However, the deteriorating conditions in the Salton Sea will cause a decrease in the pupfish, as well as invading species that can affect the pupfish. However, one thing to keep in mind for the pupfish is because they are acclimated to living in desert conditions, that they would be the most successful and outcompete the invading species if conditions are right. So the other fish that we captured during gill netting is the tilapia. So here we have a male and a female tilapia, and we have currently 6 sampling sites. These are what's in the yellow. The red and the yellow are historically where we have been gill netting since 2003. So catch per unit effort is our index for population size. And we see from 2003 to 2017, they're rather similar. And they're similar probably for different reasons. However, in our 2018 catch, it is a historic low. And so the populations are decreasing incredibly. However, here, if we look at the Salton Sea tilapia size structure for 2018, we see a lot of recruitment. So we do have reproduction going on in the sea, but they're maturing at smaller sizes. So here at this size class, the 14 to 16, when we cut them open, we see gonads, mature gonads, male and female, in this size class, moving onwards. So here, the young of the year, we see recruiting into the population, and we do see various size classes, whereas even though I don't have it up here, but if we look at the 2017, when the gill netting program restarted, it was top heavy. So there was no recruitment, and most of the fish were in the larger size ranges, which is not a good thing. So in conclusion, the Salton Sea physical chemical characteristics are tending towards more salt content, low oxygen, poor characteristics for the lake. The desert pupfish population is kind of stable, but decreasing in terms of the population sizes, as well as conditions for them to be able to grow. The increasing salinity and reduction in freshwater flow may be responsible for the reduction in the fish community in the Salton Sea itself, which are the tilapia. And I'm done. Thank you.
Okay, now we're ready for Dr. Paddlin.
Thank you, Kurt. Well, good morning. I have to move through these slides fairly, bear with me because I have several that I want to get some points across. Oasis Bird Observatory began systematic surveys at the north and central part of Salton Sea, from Salt Creek on the east to Desert Shores on the west. And our effort since 14 has been about 234 days or 2,500 hours. We estimate all water birds and numbers at each site, which includes shoreline habitat and 1 kilometer out, right angles from the shoreline. What I want to do is just briefly mention some of these habitats that are a net gain and a net loss, which has some attributes to specifically adaptive management. Not putting everything together relative to the talks this morning relative to water, but I think it's important to consider. So the photo on the left, you saw some of these photos this morning, 2005, fairly hard shoreline at the northeast end, and at the 2018, a fairly wide playa, a lot of receding. But when you get on the ground, there's some excellent bird habitat. And it's used not only for migratory breeding and overwintering. If you look at bathymetric contours, like in some of our study sites at the northeast, at 82nd Avenue and Salt Creek, there's going to be shallow water habitat for quite some time, in at least the north end. And it is typically associated with inflows, which I'll talk about in just a bit. And just quickly, just a run through a gazetteer of some of these changes. Here's 76 Avenue inflow, and 2010, 2017, you can see the dramatic receding sea, and this better picks it up. This is a March 2019. The key here is to look at those brackish pools that have formed, and again, think about those people that are bird people. This is March, the end of March. And so you have a stream of migratory birds that are using this shoreline. And this is just one example. A more subtle example is Colfax Street, shows a drain of 2009. And again, September 2018, you can see the brackish pools. And this is great habitat. I mean, this is, if you want to see birds, and we knew this in the 70s, where if we wanted to see birds, we'd go to drains, whether it be 84th drain, Whitewater River drain, but it's sure apparent these days. And here's Hayes Street, 2008 versus 2018. Hayes Street is absolutely wonderful with brackish mudflats and shallow water habitat. And here's just some quick shots of the near shore at Hayes. Salt Creek is not only for pupfish, but it's just a wonderful place for bird migrants and overwintering waterfowl. It's again thinking about bathymetrics, it's a shallow body out here that goes out 100, 200 meters. This is a debris flow that happened on 17 or during the week of 17 October, same time when Box Canyon was blown out from the debris flow. So keep your eye on this berm, the barnacle berm that's out there with the gulls on it. And so this is 5 months later. If I can get this working. So that's 5 months later. And this lasted till roughly June to July when water stopped because of the mitigation. If water was 12 months out of the year, in some years it has been, but this is absolutely one of the high use areas and what we call a hotspot, avian hotspot around the city. In closing, showing some habitat, I just wanted to show this. This is after a eared grebe flight on the 29th of March. And I presume that this is a blowout of the Whitewater, the West Whitewater levee. And this is about 375 acres. I think Doug mentioned about shallow habitats or spreading water. Maybe on a smaller form, this could be very interesting to use it as adaptive management. And then if you look to the south, same day, same flight, you can get a sense. Upper right-hand corner is 76 Avenue inflow, but you can see how that basically addressed the shallow water habitat along the sea. So what we've done is put together from 14 avian diversity and abundance hotspots. This is probably, for those folks that do birding, ornithology at the Salton Sea, this isn't anything new, but basically about 1,800 acres on the northwest side, the northeast side about 21, and then Salt Creek about 500 acres. And this is basically permanent or ephemeral inflow areas were determined through annual weekly surveys to sustain the highest concentration of birds. And it's quite apparent, although these areas, these lower areas are obviously important for snowy plover and a few other species, breeding species. And this is just the criteria for these hotspots in northwest, northeast, Salt Creek. And the key is the habitat characteristics, because all of these have some component of seasonal or permanent brackish water and shallow habitat. Brackish pools we see in the north or in our study area are used by simply everything from breeding to overwintering and migration. Just a few comments about food. Our focus obviously was birds, relative abundance, but you can't miss the food or the prey resources at the sea. Obviously, brine flies are a part of any hypersaline lake in western North America. But I noticed Doug had a water boatman photo, and from 2016 to 2019, I've been at the Salton Sea for a long time working on birds. I've never seen it like this. It's absolutely, maybe Doug has, and I've just had my head in the sand. But the left corner, top corner, and the right is basically, and those people that work at the sea, California Department of Wildlife and so on, they see this all, but these are basically slicks of water boatmen. And when you find that, it's on a calm day, calm morning, and you have birds that are foraging on those. Species richness is 15 to 20 species. Waterfowl really responded to water boatmen in 17, 18, and 19. Some incredible numbers of things like redhead ducks. You know, when you have 20,000 redhead ducks at the Salton Sea, you scratch your head because, you know, you can see that in Mexico, but not necessarily here. And then lastly, I love the shot of a basic plumage, western sandpiper with laced on its bill, its exoskeleton, water boatman. Barnacles do have a value. A couple papers talk about their predation pressure, but in fact, gulls obviously feed on them. But red knots, which have an adaptive gizzard, and does this in other migratory staging areas throughout its range in the world, both tropical and temperate. And taking fecal samples in a random sort, you would believe that out of 40 fecal samples, 37 are composed of barnacles. And then talking just a little bit about the fish aspect. These are like bait balls. So we see these up in the right-hand corner, foraging typically gulls, terns, and brown pelicans, and they typically happen in the summer. And they're super abundant. And just putting a simple cluster analysis together, I could have put another 100 on here, but simply 17 is red, 18 yellow, 19. But these tend to be associated with triangles. These, granted, we don't have data out here because we're doing shoreline surveys, but the amount of birds that are accumulating in these surface feeds are, and it's typically for 2 to 3 to 4 hours in the morning. under calm conditions. I'm going to move, simply because of time, I'm going to move past this table, but I just selected 6 species, and not necessarily species of concern, but species that we can talk about. There are declines that we're seeing. The blue plus is simply historic and stable populations relative to our work. And then the minus is something that is declining, and I can show you better in the histograms that I have. But typically, keep in mind from about 2017, late 2017 to the present, a lot of these fish-eating birds have dropped off. So first is white pelican. Here's 14 through 19. Fairly good numbers, and they reflect the 80s and 90s, and when we used to do aerial surveys. But then what happens here in 18, we're getting fewer and fewer birds on the north end in our study area. We're still seeing 2,000 to 3,000 birds in the air migrating through the Salton Sea, rarely stopping, but moving maybe to the south end or the Sea of Cortez. Brown pelicans, you typically have the post-breeding dispersal, presuming from Baja, and those good numbers until again late 2017, where and this might not have anything to do with the transition of the Salton Sea as we see over the next 10 years, but simply a regional issue. But winter or fall and winter and spring, you have very few birds that linger in the sea. It's simply those summer events. Idrisi, which lots of people are interested about. In the temporal pattern is pretty much the same. Joe Gell and I looked at in the 80s and 90s. Numbers from the shoreline are problematic because the only way to understand Idrisi on the Salton Sea is to do aerial surveys. And I'll show you why that is. We did have a peak abundance at the north end, feeding a lot on water of 300,000 birds that happened on April 18th during the peak migration period or staging period. 2019 is, again, shows the pattern, the temporal pattern of grebes leaving and sometimes overwintering at the sea, but come to the Sea of Cortez potentially, or have been there. This is an aerial flight on the 29th of March where we had, thanks to Lighthawk Conservation Aviation, we estimated 43,000 in the center of the lake. So you can get a sense of prior and post, how valuable aerial surveys are. Western Clark grebes, again, showing that trend from 14 to 17. And now we only see down at 2019, I think that's April 24th, where we had 4,000 birds come into the east side, stay 2, 3, 4 days and left. So, thank you. I put Caspian terns on here simply because work from Lyons et al. In Pacific Northwest found that Caspian terns, this is a critical staging area for Caspian terns in Western North America. And don't look at all of this, just look at the red, that's snowy plovers. Snowy plovers are doing good. They're doing great, and actually a nesting study we did in 18, we realized that these birds are nesting closer to the receding sea at a mean of about 22.5 nest placement. And things that we're studying vigorously are red knots. Prior to our work, the maximum was about 500, and red knots depreciate the east side of the Barnacle beaches, and in fact is a important staging area, probably one of 5 in Western North America. I'm running out of time. So with that, a few primary, some conclusions that are simply pet peeves more than anything, and that is consider adaptive management strategy for inflows. I'll jump down one. You have to do dietary studies and aquatic invertebrate sampling to clearly understand bird ecology at the sea. Are the brains buffering salinity and frequency of bird surveys is important consideration. So with that, thank you very much.
So this is a photograph from it's around Red Bay and Obsidian Reef. You can see in the background here, and this is just a site you don't see often anymore. This area looks quite a bit different now. This photograph is from 2014, so there's been significant change in this area. I'm going to briefly go over some environmental changes, water level, some changing habitats and prey availability. I'll talk a little bit about that. And then go into our waterbird surveys, Audubon, California waterbird surveys, and an overview of those surveys and some trends, and how that fits into a larger context of the North American saline lake system and Pacific flyway. So this is not like news to anybody in this room. We see, big decreases in sea level, and with that, we get these big increases in salinity. So the sea level decreases can cause some changes in habitat availability, and certainly with rising salinity, we see impacts to potentially habitat, but certainly food availability. We see changes in the food web there. So you can see this island is Mullet Island up here. And this is an example of disappearing habitat with the sea receding. This was a nesting colony for cormorants, and it is no longer a nesting colony for cormorants. This is in the southern portion of the sea. You can see down here. The sea receded quite rapidly, and the cormorants can't use that anymore because it's no longer an island. So that's an example of habitat change with sea level. Salinity impacts really are the driving food web changes. We see a change in the fish populations, and particularly with the sea salinity that we see now, we're reaching the upper limit of the reproductive success. The tilapia can, they're reaching their upper limit of being able to reproduce. And so we are seeing those, as Nasseer was talking about, declines in fish species. And we think that is having impacts on the birds that are using the sea. So with all these things happening, and we were hearing reports about all the changes in bird species and potential changes in abundance at the sea, Audubon, California started waterbird surveys in November of 2016. Those are ongoing surveys. They took place every other month for the first 2 years, and now they're every month. So we can capture more temporal resolution on what birds are using the sea. We have 14 sites around the sea, and so we do cover the central and southern portion of the sea. This is their standardized surveys, so they're in 1 kilometer survey boxes, and there's 20-minute counts in each of those boxes. These sites were chosen also because they're sites where we expect to find birds. These are places where we know the birds use those habitats, and they're also accessible, so we know that the people doing the surveys will be able to access those points over time. So what do we see from some of these surveys? So we saw some interesting results. We were surprised that you can see here you see, we expect to see these trends where there's, a lot of birds. This is just the total number of birds here, and the sample month of the year on the x-axis. You can see there's a seasonal trend there, but we're seeing increases in birds as we go through time. And so that was kind of surprising. And so we started to ask the question, we're seeing the fish disappear. We're getting reports of things like white pelicans disappearing. And so are we seeing these functional shifts in the community with habitat and prey ability changes? So we're wondering, are we seeing fewer of these birds eating at higher trophic levels, like eating fish and pileworms such as Idrisi? And are we seeing more of these shorebird species, or the species like ducks and shorebirds that are eating brine flies and crustaceans in the sand? And so we dove a little deeper into this, and we saw that over that 3-year period, we did see significant decreases across some of these birds that are eating at higher trophic levels. So the American white pelican, which is a fish eater, and the double-crested cormorant, which is also a fish eater, we saw significant decreases over time. This is just that 3-year study, but we are seeing that trend, and we know that we're catching the tail end of something. And so this is still seeing significant declines, and we know that our original 1 year is still probably a really low value for the seed. Eared grebes, we are seeing some changes in those too. Those are significant declines, but you can see, we saw a big decline in that second year. And then in year 3, we did see kind of an uptick. There's still a decline there in the data, but I think this corresponds to some of the water boat appearance that Bob's speaking to earlier. Again, that was kind of a short, it's just 3 years. So we wanted to look at other pieces of information, the longer term studies. And so California Department of Fish and Wildlife does aerial surveys during the fall, winter, and spring every year, and they're looking for fish-eating birds. And so these data really corroborate what we're seeing in our shorter term data set. And you can see kind of as we go through time, you see that sharp drop off there. So birds that are feeding lower on that food chain, like again, brine flies and crustaceans that live in the standard filter feeders, like the northern shoveler and ruddy duck, we're seeing stable to increasing populations there. And at least in western sandpiper, I pulled out here as a great example because we're seeing significant increases there. These are really interesting birds. The western sandpiper breeds, in the summer in the western slope of the Alaskan tundra, and then is migrating south to warmer places like the Bay of Panama, the Panama Bay, and they're stopping in places. And places like the Salton Sea are really important species that are really making these long migrations, and they're able to stop here and fatten up and give themselves energy for their next flight. And so it's really good to see that some of these birds are doing well, and the Salton Sea is really important to them. And it's really a habitat that is supporting animals that don't just use the sea, but are, we're seeing kind of across the Pacific Florida. So these guys are doing great, but we are interested in diversity. And I think that's important for any ecosystem, is having as diverse an ecosystem as you can have. It creates a more stable system. So we looked at some of the diversity statistics from our surveys. And using Shannon's index of diversity, we can see there's a lot of variation across the sea. The larger circles there are just higher diversity values relative to the other sites in the sea, whereas the smaller circles are lower values. And the colors represent similar species composition between the sites. So we see a lot of variation across the sea. I think there's some interesting questions that can come from this. But really we want to know if we're seeing changes over time. So we looked at the 2 years of data, and we're just starting to look at our third year right now. And really, when we looked at the 2 years, you can see right here that we have a decrease in species diversity. But as we go higher up into higher taxonomic levels, like family and order, those changes in diversity are more negative. And so that's kind of an indication that we're losing groups of species. So potentially functional groups. And when we look back at the species that trends that we see, we're losing the fish-eating birds. And so this information kind of put together suggests that the sea is potentially having a loss in functional diversity or some changes there. When we're looking at the third year, just at this level of species, we see that we have a higher loss in the third year than we did in the second year. And so we see that continued downtrend, and that suggests that this trend may continue, but we're certainly going to explore that a little bit more. So some larger context here, American white pelican and eared greens, I've just pulled these out of examples. This is a part of the saline lake system in North America, in Western North America. And the white pelican, as well as the eared green, in particular, the eared green, really depend on that saline lake system as part of their life cycle. And so when we see habitat changes and loss of habitat for these species, somewhere like the Salton Sea, that can be a big piece that can have broader implications for those species and populations in the Western Hemisphere or North America. So the Salton Sea, is important beyond what's just here. You may not see the birds here, but that could mean that they're actually not showing up in other places too. And when you consider that California has lost up to 90% of its wetlands, maintaining habitats for the Salton Sea is a really important thing to do. Just touching on the eared greens again, they're really dependent on saline lake systems. So it's not particularly a species of special concern, but it is considered a sensitive species because it relies on the saline lake systems, and losing a piece of that could potentially have big impacts for that species. And we see, at the Great Salt Lake, it really hosts a substantial number of the species. From 2013 to 2016, they do annual counts there, and they were counting 4.9 million birds, eared greens there. And in 2017, they had a pretty big decline in their count. And so we're not sure exactly what's happened there. People are still looking at that, but the species has a lot of limitations for what can make it successful. Declines in river, and then saline lake inflows, so like we see here. Food and staging and wintering areas, so changes in the food web could have big effects on the species. Obviously, the breeding habitat, disease, as well as mass mortality that's impacted the species. So those are big habitat changes. And we're interested in conservation. We're a conservation organization on California. And thinking about how the habitats are changing here at the sea, one of the things that we went and have kind of taken on and started to do is developing a web application for the NGO communities and the conservation community, but as well, we want the agencies to be able to do it in the public, anybody who's interested in landscape change and conservation around the Salton Sea. And so what this website does, and there's a short URL here for anybody who's interested, and we're going to try and get the monitor up out on the table later today, so people can play with this website. But we show current and future changes or projected changes to the sea. So you can see, the brown areas here around the sea are, 2018 exposed playa, and then the darker brown is the projected 2023 based on the SALSA 2 modeling values. And then we've also gone out and started to use satellite imagery to assess vegetation, near sea vegetation, so we can start looking at where there's potentially low-hanging fruit for restoration projects, picking areas where there maybe already is habitat or some form of habitat. So when somebody undertakes a restoration project, they're getting more money or more bang for the restoration dollar. There's also pieces in here, you know, we have dust mitigation sites, so you can click on those, it's an interactive site. So you can click on those and get information. Here's a Red Hill Bay restoration project. You can click on that and you can see there's live links here that take you more information about that. And so we've tried to add a lot of functionality into this for people to learn about the sea and the changes that are happening or projected to happen. So in conclusion, so we see many migratory species that are really depending on the sea, and they're migratory species. So you know, what happens at the sea has really broad impacts, and that's important to keep in mind. Some of these species rely on Salton Sea as part of that broader saline lake system, part of the life cycle. You know, and then there's other species that are just relying on it as part of the Pacific flyway piece that they really depend on every year. And so environmental changes here are impacting bird populations at the sea, and they can potentially have broader implications across the Pacific flyway. We do see dynamic changes here at the sea in food availability. You know, the water rodents showed up, and all kinds of birds are taking advantage of that. So there's dynamic changes happening. We expect that as the sea continues to change, we're going to see these dynamic changes at the food web level, and those are going to drive changes further up the food chain into organisms like birds. So for more information, you can contact myself or my colleague Andrea Jones, who's the Director of Bird Conservation at Audubon.
All right, avian disease or avian mortality at the Salton Sea, the perfect segue to lunch. So yeah, Mike asked me to talk about avian mortality, and avian disease is probably the greatest cause of mortality, so I'm focusing on this as the subject. Avian disease was once one of the biggest concerns at the Salton Sea. In recent years, there's been a decrease in disease events, and so I think it's fallen off the radar a little bit. So I wanted to use this presentation to remind everyone what potential disease has here. So we'll start with some of the history. 1933, hundreds of thousands of dead ducks were reported, and so this brought some of the nation's top wildlife disease investigators to the sea. They found avian botulism was the cause, and then they talked to locals and found out that prior events with similar circumstances were found in 1917 and then annually from 1926 to 1931. And then following this, they also noted similar botulism outbreaks in 1934 and 1939. And in the 1930s, 1930 was when the Salton Sea Refuge was established. And after that, they were looking to expand the refuge. And one of the commenters on the idea of expanding wrote this: I am convinced that one of the most valuable features of the improvement works on the Salton Sea Refuge will be those that curb botulism and thus save the waterfowl. Without adequate provisions for disease control, an enlarged refuge might become simply an aggravated death trap. And so I think that's very appropriate, given the Salton Sea management program's work on redesigning the Salton Sea. We want to make sure we don't create an aggravated death trap. Continuing with the history, through the 40s, 50s, and 60s, there were a few more botulism events noted. Let's see what else. In 1947, there was a mortality of grieves noted. And all these accounts were taken from refuge narratives. It's not sure how much surveillance was going on, how thorough the monitoring was during this time. In the 70s, a few more botulism events. In 1974, the first documented pesticide poisoning. And in 1978, the first documented avian cholera event. Also noteworthy in 1975, the National Wildlife Health Center was established. And they became very instrumental in disease monitoring at the Salton Sea. The first director of the health center was Dr. Milfriend, and he eventually took a larger interest in the Salton Sea, and we'll get to that later. And so in the 80s, the health center actively participated. They helped design disease monitoring at the Salton Sea. And despite the increased monitoring, there was a low occurrence of botulism or cholera during the 80s. There was another ear grieve event in '89, which took an estimated 40,000 birds. So now we get to the 90s, and the 90s were really bad. There were disease events annually. You can see in 1992, 155,000 ear grieves were estimated to have died. The cause, undetermined still. And also in 94, more ear grieves. 1996 was a really big year. 20,000 pelicans died. This included 8,000 ground pelicans, which are an endangered species at the time. This raised a huge amount of attention and focus on disease issues at the Salton Sea. 97 is significant, the first outbreak of Newcastle disease on the Salton Sea. Newcastle disease had been fairly limited to the poultry industry. It doesn't get into the wild birds very much. And so this was a big, it alarmed a lot of the disease experts. There was, following that, there was another outbreak of Newcastle disease in '98. And in '99, another cholera outbreak already does. So following all these disease outbreaks, it raised a lot of attention. One of the things that came out of this was the Salton Sea Science Office came into being in part because of this. Milfriend came from the Wildlife Health Center and helped establish the office, and Doug Barton was brought in as chief scientist. And one of the things they did was establish the Wildlife Disease Surveillance Program. And this was a multi-agency partnership. Salton Sea Authority, California Department of Fish and Game, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Idrisi were all participating to help in achieving early detection of disease and also rapid response. That's the best thing you can do to minimize the impact of disease. So this is some data from the health center database. You can see in the 90s, all these disease events, and I've limited this to just cholera, botulism, Newcastle disease, and then also unidentified cases and cases where emaciation was noted. So, I mean, this doesn't really show it that clearly, but the disease program did have an effect on disease outbreaks at the Salton Sea. There were botulism outbreaks every year in the early 2000s. And I think the disease program, by getting the carcasses out of the environment, getting the sick birds out of the environment, they really helped contain that and keeping the numbers low. In the last decade, we've seen, we haven't had the monitoring we used to have, but we have seen fewer cases of disease. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later. So in one of Milfriend's papers, he had this quote by Louis Pasteur: "The microbe is nothing, the terrain everything." And so what this gets at is a lot of these diseases are common. They're very common out there, and exposure happens very frequently. The main thing to consider: what turns exposure into an outbreak? What are the factors? Not just, it says the terrain is everything, but not just the physical terrain, the health conditions of the birds, the stresses they have to go through, also the individual health of the birds, and also other things like weather factors, extreme weather that impact their health. And I included these photos. These are typical photos or sites you see around the Salton Sea. And I just included these because you can see, yeah, there's something growing there. But what are the factors that make this into a problem? And when you get to places like this, you don't see a lot of birds. The birds are not stupid. They will avoid things like this. So you have to factor that in as well. looking at some of these factors, I want to talk about avian cholera, avian botulism, and so we can understand some of the factors that drive their occurrence at the Salton Sea. And so cholera, a lot of different species will be impacted by cholera, and particularly a lot of waterfowl species are susceptible. Cholera was first detected in North America in 1880 in poultry industry. It was not noted in free-ranging birds until 1944, and even then it was kind of limited. And then post-1970, it expanded geographically along the flyways. Not all species are susceptible, so some are better able at resisting. They don't get infected by the bacteria. Snow geese are a documented carrier, and so these carriers can spread this cholera along the flyway annually. And they do spread it to other birds that are more susceptible, and those birds, they usually succumb within 48 hours. And once they die, and if their carcass is opened up, bacteria then spills into the environment, and the environment is contaminated for about 2 weeks. So that's why when there is disease monitoring and disease cleanup, it's very important to not spill the birds, to handle them carefully so they don't contaminate the environment and don't make the situation worse. With avian botulism, it's also from a bacteria. However, this time it's a toxin that affects birds. There's 7 different types of toxins that are recognized, and type C and type B are the ones that affect birds. Botulism, so the spores reside in wetland soils all over the place. It's only given the right conditions that the spores germinate, the bacteria spreads, and more toxin is produced. So the conditions are organic decomposition, a protein source for the bacteria to feed on, and it's highly temperature dependent. The typical botulism cycle is a bird will die. The body, the carcass of the bird is a perfect environment for the bacteria to multiply. And so maggots start eating that flesh, and the invertebrates aren't affected by the toxins. So they crawl out, other birds see the maggots, they start eating them, and then they get sick and die. And then this starts the typical cycle of an outbreak. At the Salton Sea, the health center researchers found that a different cycle was also occurring. The tilapia were the initial source of the toxin, and they were getting the pelican sick. And then the pelican carcasses would then spread botulism to the other species of birds. And so that's where the disease program came in as essential. Pelicans, their carcasses are easy to see, they're easy to pick up. So you can find them and clean them up pretty well, as opposed to trying, once this maggot cycle got started, it was hard to find shorebirds and waterfowl mixed in with the shoreline of the Salton Sea. And botulism can be devastating. Some of the historic outbreaks, upward of millions of birds dying. So botulism should be taken very seriously. I also want to talk about Newcastle disease briefly. So I mentioned there were 3 events at the Salton Sea, 97, 98, and 2007. And all outbreaks in wild birds have been in breeding colonies of double-crested cormorants. So that's something to consider. I mean, if there's a way to limit Newcastle disease, maybe it might include limiting cormorant colony at the Salton Sea. So getting back to this quote, the microbe is nothing, the terrain everything. We have to really consider migration. Why is the Salton Sea such a bad spot for disease? And along the Pacific Flyway, birds are funneled here to the Salton Sea. This is kind of a pinch point of the flyways. The birds come from all over. During fall migration, also during spring migration, they're kind of funneled by the geography of the land. So this is a natural place for birds to come. It's loaded with food for them, so they want to come here. And it's kind of like kids coming back from Christmas break, they spend Christmas break going to parties, hanging out with different people, and then they all come back and they're sitting in a classroom together. You know, the chance of exposure goes up, and then given the right factors, that exposure can turn into an outbreak. The other thing to consider is changing Salton Sea. So we've seen these photos before, but I really want to focus in around the New and Alamo River deltas. The deltas used to be really crowded with birds. Birds loved going out there because it was hard for people to get out to the deltas. It's hard for predators to get out there. They were safe. There's also a lot of food there where the fresh water was flowing into the Salton Sea. Now when we drive by the deltas, there's not many birds there. And a big part is the Salton Sea has dropped. It's easy, you can drive a truck out to the delta of the Alamo River. So the birds are not as concentrated as they used to be. And like Bob was showing all these, pockets of habitat around the drains, the birds are more spread out. And I think getting spread out has really helped reduce the exposure that they're getting and the chance of disease. So a few design features to consider for the Salton Sea Management Program. Spread birds out as much as possible. Design for or against certain species. For instance, the cormorants. Do we want to build a colony, a large nesting island for cormorant colonies if it's just going to promote Newcastle disease of the Salton Sea? Also, might want to consider tilapia. If they're the source of botulism, do we want to promote tilapia of the Salton Sea? Very important to provide access for disease monitoring and response. There's going to be, it looks like plans for lots of little impoundments. These should all have boat launches, ways for folks to get in. And finally, create diverse and productive habitats. So productive to elevate the health of migratory birds. Often they come in very hungry, very low on energy. They need food when they get here. And diverse, diversity provides stability. So if one food source is lost, there's other food sources out there for them. And that's all I have. Thank you.
So we definitely have time for some questions before lunch. I don't know if I have folks that are roving.
Hi, Aaron Kurtz, resident of the Desert Shores. That's at the sea, by the way. For anyone on the panel, in your skilled professional opinion regarding the avian population at the north end of the sea, if and when that is developed into the North Lake concept and 400 residential homes built upon the shoreline of the sea, what would be your projected effect with the avian population? Anyone, please.
Depending on where the homes are, today, we've pretty much lost most or all of the heron colonies, and simply those herons now have reduced in numbers and moved to riparian habitats of whitewater and fish farms and so on. But to answer your question, yeah, it could, the habitats that we study along the shoreline, if there's multiple use, depending on when it is, will definitely have an impact on migratory birds. And when you start looking at, Dan could probably answer this, but when you start looking at kind of a GIS method to look at preferred habitats and so on, that might get at it. But to answer your question, basically, yeah, there will be an impact because that's kind of the last breadbasket I see along the sea. I think maybe Tom can answer some questions, but I think at the south end versus the north end, to me, it's two different lakes. I just see relative to avian diversity around the shorelines of the north end versus portions of the south end. It's, at least in 14 through 17, it seemed to be two different lakes.
It's really hard to say because, I mean, it depends on what habitat features are put in place. And you look at places like San Diego, LA, there's a lot of people there, a lot of houses. They still have a lot of bird use in those areas as well. So as long as the habitat and the food resources are there, the birds will probably use it.
Speaking of spreading the bird populations out, now that we've flooded the canals and the DCP programs in place, how are the sensitive bird habitats in northern Baja doing? Can they be uphold? Can they be improved? Should that be considered?
Bird populations in Baja, how are they doing?
That's above my pay grade on that. I'm not certain, in the sense that I know that brown pelicans and cormorants are relative to recent published ornithological papers, they're doing fine or doing okay. But to answer other, for example, red knots. There's a large component of red knots that moves through the Gulf of California, but there is a component that stays there, and a lot of our reciting banding birds come from those overwintering numbers. But to answer your question in general, I'm not going to ask.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think there's a lot of depth in this panel's knowledge on that.
But I think in general that when your question was lining canals, right? And once you do that, then you damage the habitat and then reduce the amount of wildlife that can take advantage.
I can address that question. We are doing at Audubon and the national science team. We are working in Baja and the Colorado River Delta, and we are working on some issues in the Cienega portion of Baja, as well as the Delta itself, to look at shorebirds. I don't have any answers for you, but we know that there is potential impacts coming with desal plants going in and things like that. But it's not something that I can really answer. But we are looking at this right now.
I have a kind of a larger, big picture question for Bob and Dan, and any others that want to weigh in, is that I think you both addressed the issue of connectivity with other hyper-saline or saline wetlands. And I know there's been some studies by Audubon National on documenting the decline of those saline wetlands. I'm particularly interested in probably what I see as the two most important ones for migratory birds, and that's Great Salt Lake and Salton Sea. Would you discuss the, let's say, potential impact on not just populations, but species survivability if we were to lose both of these wetlands in the next 20 years? Because that, to me, seems to be happening. There's some actions at the Great Salt Lake that will maybe kill off the invertebrate food supply, and then inaction here at the Salton Sea.
So you have a loss of both Great Salt Lake and Salton Sea. Yes. And it's a tough nut to crack because in our work on and I'll talk about breeds. In the 80s and 90s, there were some years that we had overwintering populations of 2 million, 3 million birds in the city. More like 1.5 to 2 million birds. Other years in the dead of winter, you would have 30,000 birds sitting on the lake. And then you would talk to colleagues in Baja, and they had a million acres. Why that was, I'm not certain. What we see now, and that's why I think we'll start 99 to 2000, in 19 to 2000 is to get more factual numbers on the irrigation at the sea, because potentially that's what's happening now. There's kind of a movement back and forth from Salton Sea to the Gulf and back. Joe Gell and I differ in our opinions on do they stop at Salton Sea and hold on, or do they just go to the Gulf? Well, there's clear evidence that they do stop for short durations. And during our shoreline work, which you can't necessarily use as a foundation of wintering population biology simply because you're not seeing the center of the lake. There are birds that overwinter. To answer your question, it'd be devastating for grebes, because I don't necessarily buy, they're hardwired, and I don't necessarily buy that the grebes will change from point A to point B. Point A to point B meaning they'll go to the Gulf. I mean, go to the Gulf or go to the Pacific Ocean. There's not a lot of data, I believe, that tells me that there's a shift from inland hardwire migratory behavior of the grebes versus Pacific Ocean. So I think it would be devastating if you lost, if the Great Salt Lake still produced what it does, 4 million birds in an overwinter staging strategy, and you lost the Salton Sea, I'd be hard pressed to say, well, until we know where the birds are going and why they're going there. I have anecdotal information, and that's why dietary studies are important, that a lot of the grebes were foraging on water buffalo. It was, unbelievable to, thanks to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we got out on a boat a few times, but on one occasion, Sarah and I, the wildlife biologist, you could see birds that were feeding on that. So anyway, to answer your question, it'd be devastating for me. Question would arise if one is lost, i.e. the Salton Sea relative to the Gulf, and it being 120 miles away.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it would be big trouble for grebes if we lost both of those lakes, the grebes. And I think for a lot of species, because there are other species that rely on that great, or the saline lake system there. But yes, species are kind of dynamic and resilient, and there may be, I can't say there would be a total loss for population, but it would definitely have a huge impact.
I'm going to jump in here. I want to thank all of you presenters because you've been giving us just fabulous information. But I want the two M&Ms that bother me are monitoring and management, because it hasn't taken place effectively. We have a lot of diseased humans as a result of what has gone on. And the elephant in the room is that you can stir and manage and do everything you want with that little pot of soup, but unless you dilute it and get more water in here, we're going to lose everything. And you see it, you're very polite. Everybody here has been very polite and very diplomatic in their presentations. They haven't once said anything negative, and I really commend you for that. I'm worried when I see all those deaths that have occurred. When I walk down on that crunchy playa, I'm really worried, because we breathe it up here. We're not exempt. So please, I would ask anybody here to start really seriously thinking about water importation.
I'm with the federal government, I'm here to help. Moderate. I'll just say, I don't disagree with you at all.
Microphone. Thank you.
Closer. I don't disagree with you at all. But obviously, water is a huge issue, particularly here in California. And these are decisions that will be made at certainly higher levels than my pay grade. We try to provide information up the chain so that when decisions are being made, they're being made with the best information that we can put forward. But ultimately, like I say, I would say reach out to your legislators.
We've been reaching. It could be monitored, but it goes up into a black hole somewhere in Sacramento and it doesn't come down and change the management, change whatever is going on.
Well, I appreciate your point, but we won't solve that today. So
Thank you for letting me say it.
You're welcome.
So question is for Bob. You presented a map with diversity around the drains, but none around the main rivers. And I was wondering if there's a reason for that. It says low diversity around the mouth of rivers. And if that's the case, do we know why there's low diversity there? Because it's, I mean, a river with a drain, they should be fairly similar. So I was wondering if you have an explanation for that.
I can't, whitewater, I can speak to whitewater. There, 20 years ago, if you look at Google Images, 25 years ago, that will be in the ground, it'd be on the field 25 years ago. The diversity at the Whitewinged River Delta is amazing. Today, because of the flies, the open flies, that diversity is probably, I would guess, 10% of what it used to be. However, out in the shallow water habitats, that if there are cormorants left at the Salton Sea, if there are white pelicans left at the Salton Sea, and brown pelicans, that's where they roost at night. They forage. And if you go there, you realize, so I'm talking about Whitewinged River Delta, I'm not talking about New Orleans, but that is a hotbed for roosting. I mean, every day, right, it's so gone, there are 250 pelicans, and you can time them, leaving the delta coming your way, or egrets, no egrets coming your way, and they're coming to the drains to forage. So maybe a fish biologist can answer that, but I will say that, both when you're out on the delta or near the river of Whitewater, it's teeming with life. Now granted, get away from that with those shade, but that's how all those drains are. I just think it's basically conversion in what, 40 years ago going, and I hate to say this, but what Coachella Valley Water District had done for reasons that were harm's way, they manipulated that channel and you lost some habitat. That's 40 years ago. But with you losing that habitat, you basically lost some bird species diversity. Today, you walk on that and it's 400 or 500 meters of just hard pan. And so it tells you, well, there's nothing left there, but I will say that in offshore, near shore at the Delta, it's absolutely amazing. Both the migration and even in summer, where most California gulls, Caspian terns, pelicans, pelicanopores will basically roost on that. And I don't know Elmo and New, if he can talk like that on Elmo and New, but the outfalls relative to bird species. Because of my asshole.
Yeah, there's definitely less diversity, less numbers at the Alamo and New River Deltas. I think it's a less diversity of habitats. Like at the drains, you get sheet flow over the playa, you create a lot of little micro habitats with diversity. And individual birds find what they want from those microhabitats. So if the deltas, you just have water flowing into a deep saline lake, so it's not much in the way of diversity of habitat there.
Time for one more quick question.
I have two little fishy things. One, in case anybody missed it, out here by the ponds, there's a little habitat with the endangered fish. If you want to take a look. The other question is about the endocrine disruptors and the fish that are hermaphrodite. Are you guys testing the water for the chemicals that would cause that? And is that maybe related to why the plants are not growing back as the water recedes?
So, can you clarify, did you say hermaphrodite?
Well, you said that they are both male and female fishes.
Right, they're not hermaphroditic though, they're separate.
Okay,
So
so
they're either born female or they're born male.
well, I've been watching around the world, there's a lot of like the PFAS that's being found and tested in the waters and shutting down some of the wells in California right now. That is an endocrine disruptor, so in some of the streams, there are actually fish that are appearing that are hermaphrodite, so I thought I heard you say you were both. So I was just
No,
wondering if you were testing.
they were separate. I understand your question, and there are species that are hermaphroditic, and if you disrupt their endocrine system, then then they won't be able to change, and that would be a problem for those populations. But we don't have that problem here at the Salton Sea.
Okay, but are you testing the water for any kind of endocrine disruptors?
Well, ongoing testing, no. I mean, there literally are hundreds of chemicals that can have endocrine activity. It's very difficult to look at all of them. A small scale study was done by the Fish and Wildlife Service and USGS, and they're looking at certain drain flows. There was evidence of endocrine disruption, but that was a very small scale study. I don't think it was of a magnitude that would have affected the populations of fish in those areas. But unfortunately, these chemicals are ubiquitous. We have to make many changes in the way we go about our lives in order to completely remove them from the environment. Even if we changed everything today, there's going to be chemicals moving through the environment for decades to come. As we find them, we try to address them, like PFAS. But that is, to me, even as an environmental contaminant specialist, that is to me less of a concern. I think we're dealing with much more acute issues in terms of having water that's not too salty for things to live in. So I do appreciate the concern about this, but in Salton Sea's case, it would be a pretty low priority for me personally. And okay, I think with that, we have to take a question.